What I'm going to talk about today is not exactly as advertised in the sense that I'm going to deal with the same subject, and many of you will have seen the paper which was circulated. What I'm going to try and do is take it a little bit further and talk about some particular aspects of what I'm calling vanishing surveillance. And I'll try to explain why it's worth even thinking about this and why it's important. This one is subtitled Securityscapes and Ambient Government. And the ambient government bit is the bit I want to start maybe discussing with you at the end. This is a concept I've come up with to try and think about how we understand the ways in which surveillance technologies are now becoming integrated into us in ways that are, that you'll thoroughly understand already from the work of this centre in terms of the post-human body, if you like, and into our environments. And I mean that not just in terms of our urban environments and the conventional ways we talk about it, but actually everything that we used to call nature. And I will talk more. This is exactly what I'm going to talk about today, if you like, is the ways in which surveillance is becoming embedded in part of nature, or nature is becoming surveillant. So the rough structure of this, I've got the sort of headings just to tell you where I'm going with it. I'm going to talk a little bit about securityscapes and what I mean by this term. It's a slightly fancier way of really saying landscapes of defence or defensive landscapes. And I will then talk about what difference the digital makes to this concept, which has existed within human society for a very, very long time. It's one of the oldest forms of urban structure. And I want to talk a little bit more then about how particular technologies make difference to this. And finally, to introduce ways in which this kind of technology and this kind of systems are becoming embedded into the natural world. I want to talk about this in terms of not just of a kind of ubiquitous surveillance or ubiquitous computing plus surveillance, but actually to talk about it in terms of how we might understand and think about this, why it matters that surveillance is disappearing, and what this does to our ability to make politics. And some of you may disagree on this because I've already had some challenges from people on how much this actually matters, and I hope there will be some more challenges today. There's a long history of what's often in geography or architecture called landscapes of defence. This is forms of design which involve both human and constructed environments to create something that is, that creates a boundary or a separation between us and them, or the inside and the outside. This starts with the alteration of the natural landscape for defensive purposes, where you get Iron Age hill forts in the UK, where large barrows are built up and boundaries are built up around interior spaces that are lived in. Cities as defensive spaces, walls and gates and so on, and defensive spaces within cities, of course, the kind of internal divisions, guard posts and curfew systems and things like this, which have existed as long as urban society has existed. And of course, the contemporary urbanization of the rural, that is the extension of urban styles and forms of life to more and greater parts of the planet, means that many of these kinds of urban forms of defensive landscape are actually spreading outwards now into other areas of the planet. But in many ways, as an aristocratic space in the past, in feudal times, the rural was always, in some ways, a securityscape in any case. So here's some pictures of some of what I'm talking about. This is I love this picture. This is one of the most elaborate systems of defense that's ever been invented. This is the Trace Italienne that many of you will know about from military political theory. This is actually, I think, the defense of Lille in France, which is one of the most elaborate systems of urban walling. Just to give you some idea of some of the internal divisions, this is Beijing in China, classic system of internal division where the scales of separation were based on your closeness to the emperor in terms of your rank. The city was ordered that way, so people had to live in certain areas based on their rank, and there were curfews and guard posts and very elaborate systems for determining not only where people could live, but how they could move between these places. So there were, provisions on who could walk, who could ride, who could be carried, and so on, that all connected to these internal forms of division. Some of these still have legacies in the contemporary period. This is actually in the local area where I live in Tokyo, or at the moment I'm in Tokyo, and this is a koban, which is a little police box. Many of you who've been to Japan will have seen these little police boxes. They have two little policemen who sit in there and watch people going past. Many of them are there because this is the site of checkpoints that existed during the Edo period, the pre-Tokyo, pre-modern Tokyo. And these have just been sort of transferred into the modern policing systems. They reflect a much older form of urban defensive landscape. To give you some rural examples now, both historically and otherwise. Some forms of defensive landscape are very, very different indeed. This is Machu Picchu, which we're all used to thinking of as a kind of a beautiful tourist attraction. It's actually one of the most elaborate and clever forms of defense that's ever been invented. It's a hidden mystic capital in the middle of nowhere, designed precisely so it's incredibly hard to reach in all kinds of ways. It's one of the most well thought of defensive landscapes that's ever been created. When I said that rural landscapes in the pre-modern period were often aristocratic and therefore had defensive elements, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Does anybody know what this is? What the name of this is? Anybody from...
A ha-ha is a moat.
Yeah, this is a ha-ha.
Yeah.
It's a ha-ha.
It's a phony moat.
It is a phony moat. But the ha-ha is, of course, so named because when you come up to it, you go, aha, because you don't see it. The idea, if you look at this moat in the landscape, what it's there for is designed to stop animals from predating onto the land of the aristocrats, but creating their seamless view. So the idea is it creates this idea of ownership and rulership across the landscape, but actually also prevents unwanted, in this case natural organisms, from entering your estate, cows and deer and so on. So this kind of defensive landscape is actually very much part and parcel of the class system and the way in which the class system is reflected both in urban and rural places. However, as we come into the 19th and 20th century, after the military revolution of the earlier centuries, we get more and more elaborate systems of defensive landscapes. And it becomes more and more the case that these are not anymore things that are open and there to warn people overtly of their presence and to signal something, but actually are hidden in other ways. This is one I really love. Does anybody know what this is? Just looking at this. Looks like a nice bucolic rural scene of fields and houses. This is actually a camouflage, a large-scale camouflage surface over the top of weapons factories. And this is what it looks like from the side in the Second World War in the Lockheed Vega aircraft plant in Burbank in California. From the side it looks like this. Essentially what you've got is large-scale factories which are then covered by this camouflage system which makes it look like a rolling rural area. So it hides completely, it's a kind of defensive form that hides completely the function of what's really going on there. Underneath, it looks like this. So you've got ordinary streets and many people actually living and working there with this kind of blanket over the top that sort of lets in light, some light, but actually from the top. But hopefully will fool, the idea that will fool bombers into thinking there's nothing there, but a kind of, the idiocy of the countryside, as Marx would have put it. In the Cold War, of course, this gets to extreme sort of levels, these kinds of hidden landscapes. This is somewhere where I grew up. I grew up a few miles down the road from this place. My father was an officer at the Allied Forces North in Oslo, in Kolsas. This might look like a mountain, but apparently, and I've never been in there, my father tells me the entire base, the entire Allied Forces base is replicated inside the mountain. In the case of a nuclear war, the whole base can retreat inside the mountain. They even have those little James Bond style electric, buggies that go around the place because they can't have petrol-driven cars. So you've got an entire mountain which is not a mountain. It is a mountain, but it's also a military base. And these, where I was in Denmark very recently as a visiting professor, there was this place nearby in the forest. This is Regen Vest in Denmark, which is the government's secret retreat from war and nuclear disaster. It's a donut-shaped ring inside a mountain where the government can retreat, the royal family can retreat. Of course, being Denmark, this is all equipped with beautiful 1960s furniture and stylish accoutrements, although the corridors still look like this and they're not so great. You can actually go and visit it if you find the guy with the key. It really is like that. You have to find the right man with the key and he'll let you in and have a look. It's officially decommissioned now. That's what it looks like from the outside. You can't really see very much. And there are equivalents all over the world. This is Corsham Quarries in Britain, which was where it started off as a military factory inside a quarry in the Second World War, became briefly an MI5 secret base, and there's been various other kinds of secret sites, and there are many of these kinds of hidden landscapes. So we've got a long history of these sort of defensive and hidden landscapes, which are basically natural or kind of semi-natural environments or urban environments which are not what they appear to be for defensive reasons. Okay, this is the background. What I'm going to talk about now is what's going on in terms of digital surveillance and to say in digitization, and I'll bring it back together to show you what's going on when you combine these two things together. So we're in a kind of period of history now which many people define as a surveillance society or surveillance societies in the plural, depending on how you talk about this. But I think we're entering a new period of surveillance right now. Some people have talked before about the movement from the panoptic to the post-panoptic, the Deleuzian society of control. But I think we're actually moving into a period where we're going beyond this right now. I don't know what you're going to call it, but we can't go into this thing of calling it the post-panoptic. But the components of this are several, and I want to outline them first of all. First one is that while we're in the previous slides, I was talking about very large scales of kind of activity, very large scales of activity, whole cities, whole landscapes, and so on, factories and things like that. What we're talking about when we talk about surveillance, especially digital surveillance a lot, is that size matters in a very different way. Capabilities are increasing, but size is decreasing. And this is not just in computing, but in everything. At the same time, these things are becoming, partly because of the size, mobile, distributed and networked. We know all this. I'm not going to go into the details. More importantly, for my argument today, we're increasingly moving into forms of surveillance and control which are biomimetic. That is, they look like and imitate the functions of natural objects. This is what I'll talk a little more about in a minute. And in parallel to this, all of these things are enabling technologies, and not just surveillance, but that's what I will be talking about later, to sink into the fabric of our cities, our environments, and living things and ourselves. The smaller things get, the more they can be embedded in or coat or become part of other kinds of systems, whether those are existing natural systems or existing artificial systems. So let's look at some examples of some of these trends. These are obvious ones we know about. Mobile monitoring is one we've become very familiar with in the last couple of years. From the Predator drones, which are patrolling the skies not only over Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also the borders of Canada and the USA, right above our heads right now. There are probably drones, not these drones, actually a different model, flying at 20,000 feet and over the border and scanning an area of 100 miles on each side. This on the top left here is a police drone from the US, from Britain, sorry. And these are now big and clunky and old-fashioned ones. We get much smaller drones than this now. And again, many Canadian police forces have now bought these kinds of drones. And in fact, you can buy them too. They're incredibly cheap. I was saying yesterday to the class that my 65-year-old father was given one of these for Christmas, a little drone that can fly around with a surveillance camera. It's becoming that level of kind of cheapness and affordability. And of course, Google Glass. This is the advert, the happy smiling Google Glass wearer. Mobile technologies. Size, though, as I said, is also very important here. This is, on the top left, a prototype sensor that was made by Dust Networks of Berkeley, a spin-off company from the University of Berkeley. That's 2 millimeter square radio sensor system. This is an individual radio-activated sensors which can connect together to form various networks which can do things like sense movement or whatever, various kinds of tasks. This is now very big. Hitachi's latest models are getting down towards, from this size of their original 2008. This is a person's thumb, by the way, so you're looking at the thumb print, and that is the size of one of the sensors. Now this is big. This is a human hair. This is from a couple of years ago, and these are the sensors now. So we're talking about sensors of the size smaller than the width of a human hair. And these will probably be big within a few years' time. So we're moving from sort of micro to nano. We'll come back to why this might be important in a minute. Other thing I mentioned was biomimetics, and these are just a couple of examples. We're seeing immense growth of radio control, but also increasingly semi-autonomous or even entirely autonomous robotic systems for surveillance and security purposes. Top left is a snake bot developed by Technion, which is the Israeli university largely associated with military research systems. This is supposed to be something that can go into collapsed buildings and see what's going on there. I'm sure, as I said last night, I'm sure it'd be used entirely for good and not evil. On the bottom left is a rather beautiful example of how seductive these technologies are. And I advise you all, as I said to the students last night, to go and look on YouTube for videos of this nano hummingbird. It is quite incredible. It is really, really incredible. It looks like a hummingbird, it flies like a hummingbird, it can self-correct, even though it's at the moment still radio controlled. And it is basically a tiny hummingbird-shaped surveillance device. The eventual aim is for it to become autonomous and be able to feed off electricity cables wherever it flies. And even these prototypes are difficult to tell from the natural model on which they're based. These kinds of systems are gradually becoming integrated together into kind of broader, both in physical terms, but also in discursive terms, into things which are often called either augmented reality or increasingly in urban terms, intelligent environments, intelligent cities. This is one quote about the Rio Smart City project, which is one of the most advanced of these smart city projects, saying basically the purpose of these things is to make cities run better and make dumb, rude and dirty traits of the past. In many ways, dumb, rude and dirty is exactly what attracts us all to cities, and maybe if that's a thing of the past, we no longer have cities. But this is part of a wider trend towards what Martin Dodge and Rob Kitchen have called the machine-readable world. That is the combination of ubiquitous computing, or UbiComp, with surveillance to make what I call UbiSurv, or ubiquitous surveillance. In many ways, this is an unnecessary combination to make, because as philosophers for several years, including the rather unrecognized Alberto Araya, who really should be rather better known for pointing this out a long time ago, back in the mid-90s, he pointed out that ubiquitous computing is ubiquitous surveillance from the very beginning, because you cannot have a ubiquitous computing system without having to know where things are, what they are, how they are talking to each other, and so on. So you have to have ubiquitous surveillance to have ubiquitous computing. It's impossible for this not to be the case. And this is now not just urban, we're not just talking about augmented urban environments, but we're also talking about augmented environments full stop. Haggerty and Trottier, Kevin Haggerty and Dan Trottier pointed out in an article last year that surveillance and monitoring of various kinds extends way beyond the human now into the natural realm. We've got all kinds of sensors on penguins and whales and all kinds of living beings. We've got remote-controlled rats and remote-controlled insects and beetles grown with sensors inside them by military researchers in the USA. So we're looking at a kind of increasingly an integration of these kinds of new technologies into not just the architecture of cities, but the fabric of living beings in various ways. What kinds of effects does this have? Well, we're already seeing some of the ways in which these technologies and these forms of surveillance are being integrated into landscapes in very crude and early forms. This is a crude and early form. This is a sort of automated Securityscape. So here we've got, going back to the Securityscape idea at the beginning, adding digital technologies into it. This is what you get. So this is the first crude examples. These are automated Securityscapes. And this is a Sentry Tech stationary remote-controlled weapons station on the Israel-Palestine border. Essentially, this is a system where it has motion detection along the fence line. In this case, there is still human control, so that in theory in the system, it's remote controlled rather than completely autonomous. But these systems are designed to be, or to eventually to be, autonomous systems where if somebody crossed that fence line, the machine gun operates, essentially. Shoot first, in fact, don't even ask any questions. Never ask any questions. And some places where these do operate in more automated ways are on the border of Saudi Arabia. And this is a Cassidian integrated border surveillance solution model from the Saudi Arabian-Iraqi border, which involves multiple forms of sensor array and automated and semi-automated weapons systems. So basically, it creates killing zones along the border. This is made by EADS, which is a major defence contractor from Britain. Obviously, British exports working well for the economy there. We're also seeing these being, I think, increasingly, though, these are early versions of these. They're visible, they're overt, they're clunky, they're kind of, still working in ways that it doesn't seem to live up to the promise of those kinds of high-tech visions I was presenting to you earlier of naturalized surveillance systems. However, there are forms of surveillance now that are emerging that no longer require us to know or to see where these systems are. This is believe it or not, a perimeter intrusion detection system. Can you see it? Where is the perimeter intrusion detection system in this picture? Anyone hazard a guess where it is? It's everywhere in this picture, basically. This is underlying this whole environment here is what's called a security geotextile. It's a series of sophisticated cabling systems buried in the ground which underlie the entire area in this picture. It looks like a forest, but actually it is a sensor system, a security sensor system, and made by, again, an Israeli company called GMAX, which is one of the leading players in these kinds of systems. This actually shows you, for example, one of the systems being put into place in this case in a very conventional linear form, like an invisible fence, but they can be constructed in all kinds of ways. What I think is gradually happening as we're seeing surveillance systems and security systems getting smaller, getting more mobile, becoming parts of other things or even becoming other things, is we're seeing security and surveillance vanishing. This is interesting because, why is this interesting? I don't want to revisit Bentham's panopticon yet again for theorists because this is something that keeps getting revisited all the time, but it's worth revisiting it here very quickly for a reason. Everybody talks about Bentham's panopticon as a system of visibility for prisoners in a sense where it doesn't matter if you know the guard is there or not because everybody assumes the guard is there and therefore alters their behavior. However, one of the crucial things about the panopticon is, although you may or may not be able to see the guard, you can see the watchtower. It's actually crucial to the understanding that the prisoners have of their situation, that they are in a prison and there is a watchtower. So the question here is, are we in a situation now where we can no longer see the watchtower? We don't see the watchtower anymore. Or are there different kinds of visibilities? In Bentham's panopticon, again, there are many kinds of visibilities at work. It's not just that the prisoners may or may not be able to see the guard, they can see the watchtower. There are also systems where visitors can enter the panopticon to watch the prisoners. It's already a system which has multiple and complicated forms of visibility. However, in the post-panoptic control society, according at least to Deleuze and Michalis Lianos, who develops this a little bit, he argues that really it's not even necessary for these kinds of forms of visibilities to exist. In a sense, the purpose of surveillance in the control society is to modulate flows of things, whatever they are, humans, things, non-humans, whatever, and to keep those things from moving in certain ways that are required. In this kind of form of control, overt forms of visibility start to become covert invisibilities, and security starts to be built in. I can talk about oligoptica and things later. I don't think that's really necessary right now. So what does it mean to have invisible, vanishing surveillance and security? I think it has very significant implications for knowledge, first of all. I talk about this a bit in the paper which you've read. Surveillance that's seen out of the corner of one eye, or invisible or embedded, has implications for knowledge. Let's think for example for a minute about what happens when we're in a conventional street confronted by video surveillance systems. Okay, now we're all used to video surveillance systems, most of us. I mean, maybe not in Canada as much as I am coming from Britain, but we still have the ability to walk through an urban street at the moment and to say, yes, there's a camera. And we can make some kind of judgment about that based on our ability to see that that camera is there and is watching us. Okay, we can basically frame a political response based on our acknowledgement of the visibility of this camera, our seeing of the camera. And it's I'm not going to get into the details, but it is no accident that seeing and knowing are so intimately connected within most Western languages. It's not just a kind of glib statement to say that that's the case. It's really integral, I think, to how we understand knowledge and therefore what things we can base on knowledge as a result. So we can see surveillance cameras at the moment. Given what I've just said about the way that technologies are developing, it's very possible that soon we will not have to see surveillance cameras. Okay? They will not be necessarily, they will not need to be visible. In fact, they almost don't need to be now. There are various reasons why they are still visible. I mean, some of the reasons are because some police officers still hold to the rather strange and outdated theory that people actually change their behaviour based on seeing cameras, which seems to be actually no evidence they really do in most cases, especially not criminals. So there's that reason why cameras may still remain visible for a while. Of course, there's also legal reasons. In Canada particularly, have very strong legal regimes that even if it's difficult to spot cameras, in theory you're supposed to have signs that tell you that cameras are there. Now, of course, some of our colleagues have pointed out that many of these signs are inadequate, but most of the time they are there in some way or other. Big yellow or orange signs that say you are under surveillance. In some cases they try and make a joke of it, they have to smile, you're under surveillance signs, but they are there. So there are forms of making visible there that assume a kind of politics and a kind of legal regime, in this case resulting from that politics. It's a politics that privileges forms of privacy and forms of rights that we take for granted usually within Western societies, and particularly in the Canadian context. However, if surveillance does increasingly vanish, increasingly is invisible, how does this change our knowledge of it? Let's take those smart dust things I've shown you earlier on. Now, if there's a camera in this room, and there are two of them, they're pretty visible. You can see the cameras. And I've signed a little form that says I consent to having my image being taken in this lecture. It's part of this sort of combined version of sort of legal and the regime of law and regime of visibility. However, if the people who are now filming me decided they were going to censor me in some other way, they're going to use this smart dust to track my movements in this room, how would I actually have any knowledge of this in the first place in order to make some judgment about this? How would we know already if you weren't already coated in smart dust? If it wasn't in the air, you weren't breathing it in, if it wasn't scattered all over the walls and the floors? Basically, you have almost no way, in a normal, conventional, common sense way of knowing that that is the case. And that's just one of many kinds of technologies that are disappearing, vanishing, and so on. It's also the case, and one example I didn't give earlier on, many technologies that we take for granted in what they do already, like these cameras, may not, in a few years' time, be what we expect them to be. What I mean by this is that, who knows what terahertz wave scanning is? Okay, you all know the airport body scanners that you have in Canadian airports. These are a technology that basically strips away your clothes. It looks underneath your clothes to see what is there underneath, on the surface of the skin or just inside. This relies on sending a burst of particular kind of radiation at you and bouncing it off and detecting the results. A terahertz wave scanner doesn't work that way. It works by taking the natural emanations of your body and making an image out of that. A slightly different way of doing this kind of underclothes system. A few years ago, it was thought that these things were clunky, big, and expensive, and in fact, that's the reason why they're not in many airports at the moment. They're too big and too heavy to use in the way that millimeter wave scanners are apparently easier to use. But there's now a system which was theoretically possible 5 years ago. It is now being tested in practical trials by the New York Police Department to have handheld terahertz wave scanners. They'd use them on the streets of New York to do what some people would say were virtual stop and searches. You don't even have to tell people they're being stopped and strip searched. You can just do it by pointing a little device at them as they're going past. And in theory, you can now fit these onto CMOS chips that will fit into video cameras. So, in a few years' time, these cameras could have a setting that says naked pictures. And this changes our relationship with the camera, I would suggest. Whatever we think a camera does already, it may do something different. It may become a very different kind of device. And okay, cameras have already changed several times in the history. We already had to make adjustments and to get used to a different kind of politics resulting from that. But I would suggest one of the things that comes into play here, I think, is that there are certain points at which what was previously acceptable, normal, and we could get used to, starts to become unacceptable, abnormal, and we don't want to be used to. I don't know where those lines are always drawn, but there are lines. And one example of this, which I think I've got a slide of, I'll just see if I have got a slide of this or not. No, I haven't. One example of this is the RFID chips that people were talking about a few years ago. So RFID implants, which were 5 or 6 years ago the big scare story. Everybody was, activists and also some academics were arguing that these things would become everywhere within a few years' time. Everyone would have implanted chips. Yet it didn't happen. One of the reasons I would suggest it didn't happen is because basically people did not want it. They did not want to have things put inside them. Most people. You'll always find some people who do, and there are many hobbyists who enjoy having chips put inside them, and they do all kinds of things with them and all kinds of fun. But most people seem to have a visceral kind of body horror sort of reaction to having stuff put inside them that they don't necessarily need or want. One of the arguments that students came up with last night in the class when I presented this idea was to say, well, actually, maybe it's just because they didn't bring much benefit to people, rather than being particularly bad. We can talk about that later, but there's certainly, I think, evidence in this case of some kind of a line being drawn around what is acceptable and what is not. However, how is one to make some decision about devices or technologies or systems if one is actually unable to make those kind of judgments, if one does not have a choice about where these things are, what they are, if you can't even see them in the first place? Implants, one has a choice. They can be taken out, they can be put in, you can see them, they're a physical thing that is obvious, you can feel it as well as see it. It's there, has a kind of a presence within your body that is obvious. What happens when you can't see things? I suggest this in the paper, I'm not sure how much I stand by these ideas now, but I think it's an interesting thing for discussion. I used Freud's concept of the uncanny and the adaptation that was made of this by the Japanese robotic scientist Mori to talk about the uncanny valley, where he argues that we actually become disturbed by this sort of the presence or the ghostly presence of things, things that vaguely resemble something but they might not be. And certainly when you get towards the devices like the surveillance snake, you get that kind of feeling. That may be because snakes are already something that people find disturbing slightly. And a kind of artificial snake that was actually a surveillance camera sort of adds to that sense of disturbance that people have. Or it may be something different to do with the artificial nature of the technology itself. Again, one can discuss this, but there's certainly one kind of reaction that has diverged on the sort of nature of the uncanny here. However, I think there's also something that starts to come from this that challenges our conception of what is a natural object. Now, many of you, especially Arthur and Mary Louise, have done far more work on this than I ever have and ever will do. But there is a general kind of movement towards considering natural things in various ways as sort of post-natural or after-natural or trans-natural, whether it's humanity or animals or otherwise. So there's a big sort of reconceptualization of nature going on now, and this is actually a ripe terrain for transforming nature into something that can be useful in terms of surveillance or security. What this means is that if you have objects and landscapes and things that may or may not be or a surveillance device, they may be a natural object and a surveillance device, they may be a natural object or a surveillance device. If one cannot tell, one ends up with a situation of uncertainty in which we're sort of almost continually haunted by the possibility of surveillance. It's not that we know it's there, it's not that we actually see the watchtower, but the vague suggestion that something may not be quite what we think it is presents us with a slightly different kind of, I would suggest, model for how we might behave than Bentham would have imagined in the Panopticon. This is not about a kind of deliberate attempt to make us better people. It's not a utilitarian calculation about saying, here is the watchtower, here are the prisoners, you're under surveillance, you will then adjust your behavior to become a better person. This is something rather different. It's not designed on that basis. This is occurring in a society in which we're not concerned so much anymore with this kind of soul trading. We're not concerned with making better people anymore. We're concerned with avoiding risks, adding value, those kind of neoliberal sorts of control society imperatives. But what results from this is a kind of sense that things are not quite right, but we can't see why they're not quite right. And this, I think, causes a kind of cognitive problem for us, which actually therefore results in a political problem. And this political problem gets worse because the way in which we're supposed to think about politics is largely based on not just that we know, we think about surveillance or under surveillance, but also we know where politics is and what it is. And I would suggest that increasingly, as a result of these trends, we no longer have that sense of where and what politics actually is. I mean, people like actor network theorists like Bruno Latour have made this point a lot before, that technologies embed their own politics inside themselves. They create a black box, and therefore you can't see where the politics and the technology have gone unless you open the black box up. That's part of it, but what we're seeing here is not just politics disappearing into particular technical systems, but I would suggest the entirety of the politics of surveillance vanishing into the structures of everyday life, into our cities, into our environments, into ourselves. So it's not just a matter of opening up the black box of a particular technological system, but the kind of government itself, the actual management of humanity in general, becoming more and more something that is ambient. It is something that is all around us within our environment. It's not about a particular action taking place that you can say, I think that action is right or wrong. A particular kind of technology, you can say, I think this is right or wrong. But about government becoming something fluid and flexible and everywhere, within both the structures of cities, but also in the natural world. So basically, if security can become embedded in everything, then government itself can become this kind of ambient thing. A kind of government can become something that is ultimately naturalized, in the sense it can become something that is all around us and normal and there all the time. And what I think is going on with things like smart city initiatives and augmented reality and many of these things is a kind of building in of subtle forms of socialization and behavioral conditioning that are not about some big conspiracy to make us all something, but they're indirect versions of that. It's about the kind of indirect controlling effects that result from digital risk management, from trying to find value in everything and increasingly commodify every kind of behavior or meta behavior and so on. It's like a kind of automatic and continuous Tony Blair, for those of you who remember the British Prime Minister. This kind of idea that there must be a sort of continuous conditioning of people to, through things like, antisocial behaviour orders and so on, in a kind of very moralistic but kind of not old-fashioned utilitarian way, doing it through the market. So I think we're in a position now, and I'm going to stop pretty soon, where we have to make some, I'm not going to say this kind of the cliche thing of saying we have to act now or the world ends, we have to act now or everything changes. But we're always, as Deleuze says at the beginning of things, and as Foucault said, we're always the sum of what we've been before, so in a sense we'll always have those opportunities. But there is actually a moment of big transformation taking place where we have to at least think about some kinds of interventions, because we are building structures. We are building structures that will ultimately, in the moment, condition the possibilities for future action. And we may not like the results of those, the possibilities that are being conditioned for us. So what I'm going to suggest is that if we want to reveal invisible surveillance, one has to start developing new forms of visualization, if you like. And I almost don't want to use the word visual anymore, because in the paper I start to talk about legibilities. I think we have to learn to read the world in a new way, and it isn't necessarily about seeing anymore. It's in an information age, I guess, I'm going to use that cliche, but I think it's valuable in this context. We're not necessarily talking about things we can see and understand anymore, but things we can at least read in some way. And maybe making the world at least readable in some form and making new kinds of legibilities might result in us being able to develop new politics, which will, if you like, enable us somehow to interact with these ambient forms of government and bring them more under our control and less things that will control us.
Thank you.